the product might be copied forever. Like anyone can, hire a great engineering team and like copy our UI pixel by pixel or whatever. What no one can take away from you is two things: your category, your narrative that you're sort of pioneering, but then the sort of like community of voices that are validating that narrative.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Category Champions. Today we have Anthony Kennada on the show. Anthony is the co-founder and CEO of AudiencePlus, and he used to be the CMO of Gainsight, where they created the category of customer success. So today Anthony is going to come and talk to us about what it takes to create a category, what are the people needed to build this, what are some of the things and lessons that he learned, what's the playbook that he used, and what are some of the lessons that he took from doing it at Gainsight to doing it now at AudiencePlus. I think it's a great episode, so let's dive right in. So Anthony, tell me a bit more about, let's start from today and then we'll work backwards. I know you're working with on AudiencePlus. What's the story or the strategic narrative that AudiencePlus shares to the world? Is there a framework that you use to build your story? How do you think about strategic narrative and storytelling?
Oh man, yeah, there's a lot to cover there. I think at the highest level, what I would say is we're starting a movement around this idea that for too long, marketers have rented access to their audience through social media or have paid for it through digital advertising, that we've lost control. We've lost control of our ability to actually influence the business and influence pipeline. And so there's this sort of like new kind of moment or resurgence in this idea of owned media, that we want to build a owned direct relationship with our audience in order to better be able to distribute our content to them, to understand their engagement with our content, how all of it correlates to revenue. And that's sort of the story arc that we've kind of been working on. But yeah, I mean, that has come through the lens of, trying to think about owned media as a new category, or at least breathing life into it as a new category. But the root of it is thought leadership, as you know, from your kind of interest in this area and your practice. Thought leadership is fundamentally the most important driver of how companies generate awareness and convert that awareness into revenue, especially in new categories. And that's kind of the platform that we're trying to pioneer.
When you start AudiencePlus and you're working on that story, do you have a framework that you like go back to from the beginning? It's like an old world, new world, and you guys are the vehicle to get there, or does the story come first and then we try to fit in within a framework? Does the framework come first, or are we just trying to put a piece in the puzzle?
For us, the framework did not come first. Like having built, the customer success category, like I had sort of intuition around what would work. And the problem is I started writing a bunch of things down and I had like 4 different narratives, like 4 different directions we could have gone. It's like, do you make an enemy out of, paid and rented channels, or is it the old world, new world? And so I got so overwhelmed, honestly, trying to, because, you put your heart into starting a company and you're like, this has to be like the moment, the lightning strike where we announce this to the world. The story better be right. And so I actually worked with a partner to help synthesize the narrative. So that's when the framework kind of came in. And by the way, the helpful thing for any marketer is like working with a third party that actually has a framework, that has expertise in this area, can help you kind of extract all of your knowledge that might have you feel overwhelmed and turn it into a story that's high impact. And that's what happened with us.
I love that. What was the process look like? What did the process look like when you have these 4 stories that you love and that you think could make sense, and they probably do make sense? How do you choose one how do you choose one? Is it a combination of all of them? How do you go from those stories to the final version of the story?
I would say we didn't choose one. I think there were elements of each that were important to us. And I think it was sort of just having, again, the outside perspective kind of ask more questions and kind of give us some feedback back on, you guys have been too close to this. Like, that all this is important, but some of these things are sub kind of bullets into the narrative, not the primary kind of story arc. So what ended up happening, I think, was just us putting everything on the table. Imagine like figuratively a bunch of, Post-it notes, rearranging things into the right kind of structure, and then just looking at the entire flow of the story. And for us, the output was a PowerPoint presentation. And so, our Apple keynote moment or whatever, and how we sort of leverage the story to tell it all the way through, and then we atomize it and break it down in marketing now for everything that we're doing, everything that we're saying on LinkedIn or whatever.
I love it. Is that PowerPoint internal, or is it just on the sales process? How do you guys kind of like?
It was our launch.
Leverage it?
It was our launch materials. So we filmed, recorded kind of a presentation and did a whole launch event around it. So it's publicly available. But yeah, that was the purpose of it was to use it to deliver the keynote that announces the category in the company.
I love it. Now that I wanted to talk about this later in the show, but now that you said that we have this publicly available, is there any fear around competition of like they have your story crystal clear? How defensible is a new category or a story?
I think about it a lot. And I think what I had learned from the Gainsight experience was a few things. The product might be copied forever. Like anyone can, hire a great engineering team and like copy our UI pixel by pixel or whatever. What no one can take away from you is two things: your category, your narrative that you're sort of pioneering, but then the sort of like community of voices that are validating that narrative. And so we're sort of risking it a bit by kind of putting ourselves out there a little bit more and building in public, as they say. But I think what people, unnaturally for a company of our maturity, people are viewing us as thought leaders, category creators, community activators around this concept. And we're like just over a year old as a company. So I think that the benefits will outweigh the risks. And then over time, the idea is, as we're monetizing, as we're growing our influence, there's some authenticity that we were kind of either the first movers or the ones that really championed best practices in education and community and connection around this idea, that, is more important than the next startup coming up and copying our demo or whatever, if that makes sense. It's a lot harder to do this first thing, like the category work, right?
I agree. And if you're the first educator, right? Like being the first educator to the market, I think that hits really hard. And that's something that people remember over time. I love it. You mentioned the customer success category that you work with at Gainsight. I have a few questions on that. I think that's a great example of how brands should be thinking about it. Let's start right at the beginning. Like, what does the initial strategic process look like when you join the company? Is there a story? Where's the timeline of like where you guys are to like where you guys ended? How did that kind of come about?
So we certainly didn't go into it saying we want to create a category. It was 2013. I had just joined the company probably 2 months after our CEO, Nick Mehta, joined, and we had worked together before. And he was still doing discovery, like trying to understand, kind of talk to customers, understand kind of the product better. And we had both come from a big company before that. And we did a very like big company biased type of thing. We talked to analysts right out of the gate. Like first 30 days in the job, we talked to analysts. So weird that we did that. But when we showed them the product, when we talked to them about how our customers were using it and our ICP and all of that, all of them had feedback that aligned to their existing research areas. So they said, you're building like customer support, but that's proactive. And we're like, kind of, but not really. Or they're like, you're building like the next generation of CRM. And we're like, okay, but like we're a very early stage company. Like there's a very big tower in San Francisco of a successful company in that space. We're not ready to say that. And so we left all those conversations very unsatisfied. But what we did start to do was we saw that there was this group that existed on LinkedIn called the Customer Success Manager something. And they would meet in person in the Bay Area at these like random like office parks and events. And so we went in and we sat in on a couple of those meetups, and there was this like feeling that was so palpable. I mean, it was pizza and water and beer. It was nothing fancy, but you were people were like, having this emotive experience of like, I'm finally around other people who are going through what I'm going through, and they're challenged by what I'm challenged by. So that really struck a chord with us. And we said, okay, what if we said, forget, Gartner and Forrester and all those people, and we just built a brand that championed that role, that underserved persona that no one was paying attention to in a meaningful way, at least, and helped champion their success. So we planned an event called Pulse that was meant to be basically taking kind of the meetups that they had, but throwing some venture capital dollars at it and making it all about best practices. And it ended up being like a huge proof point of our hypothesis. And so then we spent, honestly, the next 7 years, I think 10 plus years now, the company kind of taking that one-time event, which was basically like an expression of best practices, thought leadership, connection, community, where we weren't the ones always on stage telling the world what to do, but we were convening the voices of the category. And we activated entire content and marketing kind of strategy around that. And only years later did the word category come up, and customer success became kind of a known entity.
I love that. I always hear thinking about category creation as like creating this new movement. It seems from what you're saying that like the movement already existed. It just needed kind of like a common ground, right? Like kind of like the railroads for the movement to like continue forward. But there was already a group of people that like were having that feeling. Do you see category creation as like we need to create something from scratch, or is it more about looking for underserved people that are already having that feeling? I'm not sure. I'm not sure which one of the two it is.
Good question. I think it's not the case that in every new category there's an underserved persona. For example, in marketing, right? Like what we're doing, owned media is selling into B2B revenue marketers, like not underserved. There's an entire like market, overserved as a persona. Whereas with Gainsight, it was this niche group. I just spoke to a prospect just before this that sells to treasury people. I couldn't tell you what that even is within the finance team, but it's very much a role and a important one. So I think there's a clue into category creation if you do have an underserved persona, because they likely don't have existing budget to buy a operating system for their job. And so with that, they likely may not have a seat at the table to make some of these decisions or budget to build kind of like a massive team. And so those are some of the signals that there might be something there from a category perspective. Or it's just a new problem that you're able to discover within an existing persona. And that's kind of what we're trying to shine a light on. So you hear me being annoying at this point on LinkedIn talking about this problem. I'm not talking about our solution. I'll happily show people a demo if they want to see it. But right now we're just spending all of our marketing calories pointing the attention on this problem. And the most fulfilling early signal of category creation that we're seeing is when other people say it back. Like, you're right. Like, we shouldn't just rent our audience from LinkedIn and be beholden to that algorithm. That's interesting. We shouldn't just put a video on YouTube and hope for the best and call that kind of, a content marketing campaign. So that's, I think, the way I would approach it. It's either a new problem or a underserved persona.
I love it. Yeah, because I think of category creation as like creating these movements, right? And if the movement has already started, but nobody has like built a church for it, I think that's great. But sometimes you need to create a whole new religion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. So obviously you and I talk a lot about category creation a lot, but how did the new category at Gainsight impact other areas of your company, right? Because I think category creation, some people think it's just for marketers, and I think it goes beyond that. Tell me about how it transpires into product, sales, maybe recruiting, fundraising. How do you think category impacts all these other areas?
It touches everything. I mean, I think, especially for startups, like investors want to invest in market leaders. And so there's a natural kind of things just get easier when you get your thought leadership engine kind of running. So in our case at Gainsight, hosting the second Pulse conference got us our Series B of funding because, we had about 1,000 people, I think, there for a couple-year-old company. We did an investor panel, and we brought on a bunch of prospective investors that weren't our existing ones, and they're like, holy crap, like what's going on here? And they got a taste for the movement. And to your point, they got a feeling that you can't like really understand unless you're in the room kind of when in some of those moments. So certainly from a fundraising perspective, category marketing kind of funded Gainsight basically. From a sales perspective, we found that sort of like a gift and a curse. The gift of it is when you looked at us versus the incumbents, or not the incumbents is a bad way of saying it, the competitors that we were kind of selling against who didn't have the community, the thought leadership, the podcast, all these other things. They wanted to do business with a company who they shared values with, or they felt like they had received some value from through the kind of content effort. And so our win kind of rate against competitors was, ridiculous, I think, overall. The curse of it in a new category is you might get a bunch of people that care deeply about the content and they come to the events, they come to the webinars, all of that, but they have no interest in buying the product. And so for that cohort, it's a longer game to kind of hope that they, see the light at some point, or that they join a company that has an active initiative or something to that end. And from the people side, from a recruiting perspective, there's something very like, you know this from your business, like creating a category is extremely hard. It's the hard road to doing this. But for a lot of companies like AudiencePlus and Gainsight and others, it's the only path forward. But I would argue it's the most fulfilling way to build a company for the team, because it's at its core, there's purpose, there's mission, feeling like you're going to work every day to help not just sell software, but actually help people do their jobs better and find more fulfillment in their work. So I think honestly, it's impacted, you can't imagine a version of Gainsight without category creation even existing.
Yeah, I love it. We've talked about how it touches so many areas of your company. Does the CEO have to lead category creation with the CMO? What's the role of the CEO? And also for marketers that are struggling with a CEO that's not marketing focused, how do we explain the value of that, or should we just quit and go somewhere else?
I think so. I think it's very hard to recover. It's very hard to recover. And it has to start at the top. I had a call earlier today where we were discussing this. The risk is category creation is not a marketing initiative. It's a company strategy. So if you have marketing off in a corner, doing this, and the sales team's not buying into it, it's going to die on the vine. So you need the CEO to come in from a tops down perspective and champion it. The other thing is, depending on kind of how you want to activate it, it could be fairly expensive, meaning we had no business as a company of 20 people hosting a conference for 300 people or whatever. It was a bet we had to make. Thankfully, the bet paid off, and it was one of the best things one of the top 3 best decisions Gainsight had made. But you need the CEO to approve that crazy idea, that the lightning strike or whatever, that might kind of, make all the difference in the end. So some of it, at least 10 years ago, some of it is hard to measure. I'm hopeful with AudiencePlus we can help kind of bridge that gap a little bit better. But without a CEO that is excited and leaning in and patient and willing to take the risk, I think there's a high risk of failure for sure.
Yeah, we've had to turn down prospects for our agency side because the CMO is all in, but the CEO isn't, and we're like, we could take your money, but it's not going to work if the CEO is not in it. So we'd rather not do it. It just doesn't work because it's so much bigger than just marketing. You were mentioning you were a company of 20 people throwing these huge events. I used to play basketball. I'm thinking, what's the starting 5 of a category creation team, right? What are the people that you need on a category creation team to make it work? What are the roles? What are some of the people that worked at Gainsight with you to achieve that? Because I'm guessing it's a team effort because it's such a big project.
I play basketball too, so I love the analogy. I think you need the point guard who's going to be the dreamer, the one with high ambition that's sort of pulling people towards this kind of vision that is unseen today. And that could be the CMO. I think in Gainsight's case, that was probably the role that I played, was really pushing the boundary of new ideas and all of that. You need the counterweight to that. You need the in my case, it was the demand marketer, the revenue marketer, who was hey, that's a cool idea, but if you just give me that budget and let me run it through AdWords or whatever, I can generate more pipeline. And that tension was actually really good because you need someone to own distribution of these. You need someone to help obviously make the ideas come to life, but also to get distribution from your audience around them. So I think there's a revenue marketer role. I think content marketing is huge. I think about that in my world today because the formats have changed for how you distribute this information. Content's like the oxygen for category creation, like, events in podcasts like this one, live streams, podcasts, ebooks, all of these things are what helps like actually communicate the narrative, right? Where am I? Fourth, events. So I think there is something special that happens when people come together. And your ability to be the convener for the community in person or digitally, but if possible in person, I think is extremely powerful. And if I have to pick five, I think I'd stop it there on marketing at, five. Well, the one that comes to mind is you need, I think, a strong partner in sales. Because again, if sales is off running like a playbook that, looks a lot like Snowflake's go to market and not a value selling type motion, the sales methodology could introduce friction to the category creation if they're not helping both serve each other. So I think you need a good partner in sales to help kind of take it, take the monetization strategy the whole way.
Yeah, I love that. We have our starting five. It is. I love it. We were just talking with Jared, which I know you were on his show, about communities, right? And I relate communities to events, right? They're not the same, and obviously in person they're better, but these communities are like the churches of the religion. And I keep using this analogy, but it feels like a place they need to congregate, and I think it's so important. A few questions more on this, and then I want to move on from Gainsight. But how did you guys measure whether the story was working or not? What were some of the KPIs of like building a new category from something that at that point you're probably not even thinking about creating a new category? How do you measure? Is it a go? Is it a no-go signal? How do we go from here?
Yeah, I think there's several things you can do, quantitative and qualitative, I think, in category creation. The easy one's qualitative. I think we had people coming up to us that at our event that basically said, I can't wait to be a Gainsight customer one day. And they never even saw a demo of the product, but they wanted to be a part of what we're building. So there's something about that. We started looking at like event attendance as a proxy of customers being at risk and potentially churning, or prospects and the conversion rate if they came to our event. So there was definitely correlation there. But the top of funnel metric that I always thought about was what I called back then like opt-ins into our marketable database, what I call today subscribers. Basically, who are the people that are saying, I love the content that you're producing on category X. I want to hear more from you about that topic. And so to me, the leading indicator is not just web traffic or some of that. It's who's subscribing, who's opting into our kind of content. And with AudiencePlus, we're sort of trying to build that whole kind of piping out. But then from there, it's all of the funnel metrics in between. So it's okay if folks are coming in through a marketing channel, through a content program, an event, a webinar, whatever, what does the win rate look like versus folks that are coming in cold or coming in through an outbound effort or whatever? And you can start to measure the impact that way on win rate. So that's sort of how we, at a very high level, thought about it. But then, there's how engaged are your subscribers before they actually become prospects. And you can look at all the micro kind of metrics in between.
I love it. I think that's a great answer. I want to zoom out a little bit, and I know we just have a few minutes left. How focused are you in terms of your competition, right? Like when you're building AudiencePlus, and when we're thinking about building a new category, is competition something that you keep in mind? It's something that you think we're so completely different and so new that we don't even look at it? How much of your brain share does competition take?
It's a good question. With AudiencePlus right now, it's about 0% brain share, mostly because we can't identify a direct competitor, which means we have to create a category. Again, if there was an easier path, we'd take it. But also, there's just so much work to do, and there's so much vision ahead. Like we have like the next 3 years kind of, already kind of road mapped out in terms of the product work, the marketing work. So we know exactly kind of what we have to do, and we're like just radically focused on execution there. That may seem like a politically correct answer, but the reality behind it is we just don't have time to look around like our corner and say like, who could potentially get into our space maybe, and what could that mean for us? But the second piece, and I'm sure other folks have said this too, competition is actually good in new categories, because like I'll give you a very tactical example from a very early stage company trying to create a category. I can't even create a G2 quadrant right now because they're like, this is awesome. And I know Godard personally, and he's like, give me the 3 to 5 companies in your category and we'll launch it. I'm like, there are none. And so I can't. And it's like, great. As soon as they pop up, let me know and we'll get that going. So you need competition. And I think again, going back to our earlier conversation, focusing on your customers, on their ability to validate your unique positioning and narrative, and for them to be able to point back and say, it was this company that is leading the charge. That should be the maniacal focus. Competition will inevitably come up. And when they do, they're going to help validate that there's actually a category here. And your customer voice is going to point to you as the market leader in it. And G2 will then, hopefully, as part of that, put you in the top right of the quadrant that you are responsible for helping create.
I love that. Last question before I'll let you go. What's the relationship you see between story and the languaging of a new category, especially when you name and claim a new category? Where does the naming come from? Is it this new world that you've created? How do you see story and strategic narrative with category creation? How do they mix?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we had an easy one with Gainsight because it was the job of customer success manager. As we said, it's customer success. And I wish I could, every time I tell people that, they're like, all right, great. I wish there was a role that like no one is paying attention to for our category. With marketing and owned media, I think it's sort of like it's an intermediate step. So I think owned media is sort of the vision for the category naming today, but I think it's not it's not the end game. I think there's much more coming behind it, but it felt like it was like our narrative and what our goals were as a company strategically is to convince the world in step 1 of our master plan to move from rented and paid acquisition to owned acquisition. And so we knew we needed to really go on and focus on this idea of building an owned audience. And owned media is a topic that has been covered in textbooks for marketing for years. We just haven't really focused on it or called it that. And so it felt like almost like an empty storefront that no one was really occupying, and that we can go in, move in, paint the walls and make it this like really cool thing. And so that was the decision behind that. But 3 to 5 years from now, I don't think it's owned media that we're like writing the book about. I think it's about something much, much bigger than that. But it's sort of paving the way for it. So I guess the lesson there, if I were to try to play it back to marketers, it is important to name and claim. It's important to hook your hat on something so you become known for something. And from a digital marketing perspective, when they Google that keyword or whatever, your content is what's coming up. This is the official conference of that thing or the podcast of that thing. So there's a lot of merit to it. But I also don't think I think there are ways to evolve it over time based on kind of what your goals are kind of for the market.
Totally agree. I think category creation is like having a product roadmap, right? Like what looks today is not going to be what's going to look in 3 years, and that's okay. But you need to do that. Awesome. I think, Anthony, this is a good place to pause it. I would love to do a part 2 at some point because I think there's so much more for us to cover. But I think this was a great packed episode with a lot of things that we covered. We will put the links throughout. And Anthony, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Marty. Thank you.
Absolutely. My pleasure.